At the same time, the deindustrializing period is seeing large waves of migration from the former colonies into the former colonial powers. This is something else that we haven't fully wrapped our minds around. Why is this happening? We can understand why so many people migrated to the United States when it was industrializing, the demand for factory labor. But why are people moving from the former colonies into the former colonial powers just as they are deindustrializing? Where's the demand for labor? And why from the former colonies? Well, they're moving from the former colonies primarily because of labor recruitment systems that were set up to take advantage of cheap colonial labor during the colonial period. The separation of subsistence farmers from their lands, their forced labor in colonial enterprises, and even their recruitment to work at the lower ends of the economy in the industrial powers themselves during the colonial period. In the deindustrializing period, some of them are still going to work in factories because as deindustrialization occurs, the working conditions in the factories are declining in the colonial powers in the first world. At the same time, citizens of those countries are having to work more and harder to maintain the standard of living that they have built up for themselves over the past 2 centuries, even though they're getting all these cheap products that are made with even cheaper labor in the third world. And as they're working more and more, they're depending more and more also on cheap services. And it's in those cheap services that the new immigrants coming from the former colonies are coming to perform. So the labor relationship between colonial powers and colonies has a lot of continuities all the way from 1492 to the present. Even though on the surface we see industrialization, deindustrialization, industry moves, the fact that in the former colonies this excessively high standard of living has been created that can exist only through exploiting the labor of people who don't live at a similar standard of living, whether in the colonies or whether in the internal colonies that are created as people from the third world are brought to the first, is a continuity that runs through all of the periods from 1492 to the present. I did it in 15 minutes. Did everybody follow that? I'm not done yet. Okay, so what does US immigration policy have to do with this? How can we weave that story into the history of the global economy? Human beings have been migrating over the face of the planet ever since we first stood upright somewhere in East Africa tens of millions of years ago. See, this history is actually even longer. The idea of controlling immigration or controlling migration is actually very, very new. That is, only in approximately the last 200 years have nation states tried to control how people are moving over the face of the planet. So it's salutary to remember this when we think about, well, what would happen if we stopped trying to control immigration? For tens of thousands of years, the human race had no controls on immigration, and somehow we muddled along. Things worked themselves out without immigration controls. It's not impossible to imagine that we could create a new system that did not rely on trying to control people's freedom of movement. So how and when did immigration controls come into play? Think about the history of the United States, and I'm going to be focusing on the United States here, but interesting things are happening elsewhere in the world in some kinds of parallel ways too. Obviously, the first English people to migrate to the United States did not face any immigration restrictions. There was no body capable of enforcing any immigration restrictions. And in fact, they came not as immigrants, but as conquerors. That is, their goal was to displace the native population, to eliminate the native population, and set up their own structures of governance that excluded the native population. So to call it immigration is in a way fallacious. I think we should call it conquest, as we do when we talk about the Spanish, because it was in fact a conquest, not a migration. With the independence of the United States, citizenship was created in this new polity created by English people who had conquered, eliminated, and enslaved non-English people. And the first citizenship law of the new country very clearly restricted citizenship to free white persons. So clearly not everybody living in the polity was a free white person, but only free white persons were eligible for citizenship. So citizenship as a way of dividing the population, as the way of excluding certain people from the rights of citizenship, and in particular as a racially based system of exploiting labor, because what was slavery if not a racially based system of exploiting labor? Using citizenship to justify a racial exploitation of labor and essentially an internal colonial relationship is built into the very notion of citizenship in the country. But citizenship didn't have anything to do with immigration. Not only were people of color, people from Africa, invited to come to the new United States, they were forced to come to the new United States. They just couldn't be citizens of the new United States. Likewise, Native Americans were here in the new United States, but they couldn't be citizens. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the concept, an expanded concept of citizenship was created for the country. And the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868, creates this new form of citizenship. I want to read to you from the 14th Amendment. It says, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." Now, note how US government documents always use the term all when they don't really mean all. Like, we take these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Obviously, that didn't mean all men. So when they say all persons born or naturalized in the United States, they don't really mean all persons, and the very next clause explains why, because there's a qualifier, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Not everybody who's born in the United States is subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. That is, Native Americans are legally qualified as not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, therefore citizenship by birth does not apply to them. So there's a big except inside that all. The 14th Amendment was intended to try to find a way forward after the abolition of slavery and to address the problem of the population of African origin people in the United States who had been denied citizenship. What is the country to do with them in the aftermath of the Civil War? Citizenship by birth was intended to extend citizenship to people of African descent, but nobody else. But citizenship wasn't everything, and it's interesting to go on to read what rights pertain only to citizens and what rights really pertain to all people, not just all people who fall into this privileged category of being eligible to citizenship. The second sentence goes on to say, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." So they can make laws that abridge the privileges and immunities of people who aren't citizens, just not of people who are citizens. "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." So persons have certain rights, and citizens have more rights than what the rights that just persons have. But persons do have some rights. even though they don't have all the rights of citizens.